37.
President Obama and British Prime Minister David Cameron say they will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Mr. Obama says Tehran has a stark choice.
Tehran must understand that it cannot escape or evade the choice before it. Meet your international obligations or face the consequences.
Iran says its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, and it's not giving up any of its rights in moving to return to talks with permanent members of the UN Security Council and Germany, a group known as the P5+1.
Today's focus for Eye on the World is Iran and the nuclear issue, and New Zealand's role in keeping the Middle East nuclear-free, or non-role in keeping the Middle East nuclear-free as it may be. Joining me from 36 Parallel Assessments, he's the co-founder and principal. It is Paul Buchanan this morning. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning.
First up, can you give us a bit of a roundup, an overview on the current state of play with Iran and its nuclear ambitions?
Well, right now there's a standoff between Iran and the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Association, as well as the West. And basically it's because Iran refuses to allow inspectors to go to suspected military sites, including the Pinshar military base, where there are suspicions that they are attempting to weaponize a nuclear device. I should point out that there is some hypocrisy involved in the West, and that the IAEA really does not mind having uranium enrichment facilities for peaceful purposes, which is what the Iranians say they're doing. But they're acting as if Iran should halt its nuclear development in toto, if you will, and completely. And the Iranians, needless to say, are opposed to that. So everybody's ratcheted up the rhetoric to the point now that there is a standoff, and there is the possibility that with a miscalculation or a misunderstanding, we could see the beginning of war. I will note also that the hawkish rhetoric that we see on the part of the West is driven by domestic electoral politics. In particular, right-wing conservatives in the United States and Israel ratcheting up their rhetoric for domestic political reasons. It has nothing to do with Iran. And the irony here is that in Iran, exactly the same thing is going on. Conservatives are split in Iran between the Ahmadinejad camp and the theocratic camp. And so they're sort of outmaneuvering each other with their hawkish rhetoric. And quite frankly, that's not a good situation to be in. Again, all driven by domestic politics rather than international relations.
Sure. It's also interesting that there is this pressure on Iran, whereas North Korea, who have already have nuclear weapons, there doesn't seem to be the same pressure applied to them.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, contrary to what we hear, particularly from the right wing in the West, is that Iran is perfectly rational in attempting to secure a nuclear device. And the reason for that is very simple. Nuclear weapons are deterrent weapons. We must remember that other than in 1945, none of these weapons have ever been used in anger. What they're used is to back off a superior conventional force. And Iran has seen its eastern neighbor and its western neighbor invaded and occupied by nuclear powers. And so they're quite rational in thinking that if they're able to develop a nuclear weapon, they can back off the United States in particular, and that's where rationality runs into the face of the harsh realities of domestic politics. So again, North Korea was able to leverage its development of a nuclear weapon for food aid and other, in fact, petroleum, all sorts of things, in which I must point out, New Zealand was involved in brokering deals to get them to delay their nuclear program. And that's the irony, is that the rationality of the Koreans was rewarded with international concessions. In this case, the rationality of Iranians is being punished, and in all of this, New Zealand is where to be seen.
Well, yes, so that's a good point. So New Zealand has a very strong history in taking a stance against nuclear weapons. Where are we in this Iranian issue?
Well, that's very interesting because you may think at first glance that New Zealand has no role in this, but it's exactly because New Zealand is a non-nuclear state. One of the founding members of the IAEA, a member of the Nuclear Supply Group, a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. New Zealand has a long and storied record of being involved in non-proliferation issues, and yet we don't see it anywhere when it comes to trying to mediate between Iran and the West. And I find that rather striking because New Zealand actually was on the board of governors on the IAEA from 2008 and 2010. And what's interesting about that is in 2010, the UN Security Council issued Resolution 1929, which imposed very hard sanctions on Iran, economic sanctions of various types, as well as sanctions on the freedom of movement of Iranian officials, and New Zealand supported that. It then stepped off the board, although a New Zealand diplomat did chair the IAEA conference last year, which spoke, its central issue was to increase the sanctions regime even more. So New Zealand is actually, it appears, to have backed off, gone quiet, yet subtly shifted its position towards a more... And I will say this reverses, of course, the Labour government's attempts to mediate and offer some sort of independent interlocutor role between the West and Iran. Now what we seem to see under National is, again, a subtle, or not so subtle, depending on who's reading it, shift towards the Western position, and that opens up a can of worms should the confrontation between Iran and the West become belligerent.
Does New Zealand, do we have any worries about our relations with Iran, particularly with trade?
Well, we do. I should point out that New Zealand opened an embassy in Tehran in 1975. It's the oldest embassy that New Zealand has in the Middle East. And we export about $250 million worth of goods to Iran. Most of that is milk products, but also some manufacturing, some meat products all go to Iran. And in exchange, we get about $15 million worth of imports, mostly petroleum products and some agricultural stuff as well. That pales in comparison to the trade that we engage with the Sunni Arab world, which is approximately $2.5 billion worth. Egypt, Turkey, and what is known as the Gulf Cooperation Council, which involves the Gulf states, Arabia. The volume is way than that with Iran. And the reason I bring up the Sunni Arab world are the people who are most concerned about Iranian nuclear weapons are not Israelis, it's the Sunni Arab world who are pushing very hard for the West to curtail Iran in some way. And so if, pardon me, if we were to side with the West openly, we might see some trade repercussions with Iran, but quite frankly, relatively speaking, the harm to New Zealand will be minimal.
Okay. Paul Buchanan, thanks very much for joining us. People can find out more at 36th-parallel.com. We appreciate you joining us for Eye on the World today. Time now here on Kiwi is 8:45. Got a train